Elias Wren stepped off the shuttle with the calm of someone who had nothing to prove. His boots touched the polished alloy floor of Argento Prime, the neutral zone diplomatic station hovering in the dark between two warring galactic titans. Around him, representatives from a dozen species moved with purpose and tension, their postures rigid, their eyes suspicious. Elias simply adjusted the strap of his messenger bag and smiled at no one in particular. He was the first human to ever attend a galactic-level ceasefire summit. His official title was Observer, a term meant to sound important while signaling he had no authority whatsoever. The United Human Confederacy had only recently gained formal recognition as an interstellar presence. Earth was still considered quaint, unpredictable, and a bit too emotional to be trusted with serious decisions. That was fine by Elias. He didn't come to make demands. His quarters were small, functional, and entirely adequate. The coalition hosts had provided him a hospitality AI, a sterile briefing packet, and a selection of synthetic teas he didn't plan to drink. As he unpacked, Elias glanced at the agenda. Day 1, Introductions. Day 2, Status Presentations. Day 3, Negotiations begin. He flipped the datapad over, not out of boredom, but because he didn't like being told how stories were supposed to unfold. The other delegates met that evening at the high-level orientation dinner. Skorak of the Zrathan Dominion made his presence known immediately. Towering, armored, and bred for command, Skorak didn't eat, didn't speak to anyone who wasn't of strategic value, and didn't sit. His mere presence sucked the energy from the room. Elias, by contrast, sat quietly at the far end of the long table, sipping water and sketching in a notebook. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer opinions, but he watched. When the conversation veered toward the collapse of frontier settlements, Elias leaned in, listening closely. When a coalition envoy mentioned the word sacrifice, his pen paused mid-sketch. Skorak noticed. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. Skorak's stare was calculating, practiced, cold. Elias smiled and returned to his sketch, an oddly cheerful rendition of the room, with each delegate portrayed as an exaggerated caricature. The dinner ended without incident. No arguments, no breakthroughs. But as the delegates filed out, a junior aide whispered to her superior, "What's the human even doing here?" No one answered. Elias, back in his quarters, closed his notebook and whispered to himself, "Just watching. For now." He didn't plan to change anything, but the galaxy was already shifting around him. The first official negotiation began with the weight of expectation pressing down on every soul aboard Argento Prime. Delegates from the coalition entered the chamber with measured grace, layered in robes that shimmered with the insignias of their fractured alliance. The Zrathan Dominion arrived next, flanked by silent honor guards in obsidian armor. Their entrance was deliberately slow, theatrical, designed to establish dominance without a single word. General Skorak stood at the forefront, arms crossed behind his back, eyes like twin blades. Elias Wren walked in last. He took the smallest seat, furthest from the center, and was handed a listening device and a notepad by the station staff. He accepted them with a courteous nod, but his own analog notebook was already open on the table in front of him. He clicked his pen twice before placing it down. The sound echoed faintly, slicing through the sterile quiet. The coalition's lead negotiator, Ambassador Urine, opened with a rehearsed appeal for peace. She referenced treaties, historical trade routes, and the mutual benefit of coexistence. It was diplomatic language, safe, bland, and forgettable. Skorak responded with a slow tilt of the head and a sharp observation. "We do not bargain with weakened hands," he said, his voice deep and mechanical, as if crafted by war itself. "We decide the terms when the war is over, not before." The room chilled. Elias's pen scratched faintly against the page. He was sketching again, something circular, spiraling. Skorak's eyes shifted toward him for only a moment, then returned to Urine. "We understand your position," she said, voice steady but tight. "But these talks are about halting needless bloodshed." "Blood is never needless," Skorak said, when it fertilizes victory. A beat of silence passed, and then Elias spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut cleanly through the room. "Do you always telegraph your moods?" he asked without lifting his head, "or just when you're unsure you'll win?" Every delegate turned. Even the AI recorder paused for a half-second. Skorak did not respond, not immediately. He stared at Elias, not with fury, but with something deeper, calculation. A strategist considering a variable that hadn't been on the board a moment ago. After a long pause, the Zrathan general spoke again. "We are finished here for today." And without waiting for consensus, he stood and left the chamber. The session was adjourned minutes later. Back in his quarters, Elias added a single note beneath his spiral sketch. Provocation successful. Subject aware. The second day of talks began under a veil of quiet tension. Something had shifted. No one could quite define it, but they all felt it. The air in the negotiation chamber had lost its carefully constructed balance. The coalition's ambassadors spoke more cautiously, their glances darting toward Elias with increasing frequency. Even the station's AI moderators paused longer between turns, as if recalibrating expectations. Elias sat in the same chair as before, small, distant, unnoticed by protocol, but impossible to ignore. His sketchbook was open, filled with rough, looping lines that looked random until you stared too long. Some thought it was art. Some thought it was code. The Zrathans entered with less pomp. Skorak, though still imposing, made a subtle change. He sat this time. The conversation resumed, but the content was no longer the same. Skorak's tone had lost its earlier confidence. His sentences were shorter. He responded to challenges with curt nods or brief counters, no longer expanding into declarations of dominance. He didn't mention blood or conquest. He didn't mention victory. The change was small, but undeniable, and it didn't go unnoticed. Ambassador Urine sent a secure message to her assistant during the session. "Is the Zrathan tone softening?" Her assistant replied with just 3 words. "Because of Ren." Back in the observation lounge, diplomats gathered in clusters, whispering in the soft hum of indirect lighting. Elias passed through silently, hands in his pockets. A pair of Thalvid delegates paused their conversation as he walked by, studying him as though he were a new species entirely. One muttered, "He hasn't done anything," but the other replied, "Exactly." Later that evening, the coalition's senior advisor, a grizzled Arcsan named Kalrin, confronted Elias in the mess hall. The place was nearly empty. Elias sat at a corner table, quietly drinking what passed for tea of Wort Argento Prime. Kalrin leaned over the table and growled, "Whatever game you're playing, stop. This isn't your war." Elias looked up, calm and clear-eyed. "I'm not playing a game," he said. Kalrin's stare was hard, but Elias didn't flinch. After a moment, the Arcsan left without another word. The next morning, 2 Zrathan warships were observed altering their patrol paths near Coalition territory. No violations occurred, but it was the first time the Dominion had adjusted its movements since the war began. No explanation was given. When asked for his analysis, Elias submitted only one line to the Coalition briefings. "The pattern has cracked." Junction 9 wasn't on the official negotiation map. It was a side module of Argento Prime, designated for low-risk civilian activity. Food distribution, minor repairs, and a pediatric medical wing for displaced refugee children. So when the alarm triggered there, quietly, without fanfare, most officials didn't even notice. The security breach was flagged as minor. No injuries, no major systems compromised. But someone had bypassed 3 layers of access authorization and entered during restricted hours. The station's automated protocols contained it and filed the report. Elias Wren noticed. He read the breach summary in the early morning, while sipping coffee that tasted faintly of metal. The description of the intruders, 2 tall figures moving with precision, avoiding all organic life, placing small devices on ventilation panels, was too deliberate to ignore. He didn't request permission. He didn't bring security. Elias walked alone to Junction 9. The pediatric ward was quiet. Crayons and art tablets were scattered across low tables. A mural covered the far wall, painted by refugee children during a therapeutic workshop. It was a riot of color and feeling. Planets with smiling faces, a sun wearing sunglasses, a dozen different alien figures holding hands in a big circle. One looked vaguely human, with wildly exaggerated hair. Elias stood in front of the mural for a long time. The devices the intruders left behind were cleverly hidden, small, disguised as air filters. They weren't bombs. They weren't poisons. They were passive scanners, tuned to detect emotional frequency shifts and nonverbal biometric responses. He knelt beside one and tapped the casing. Then he looked up at the smiling mural again. "Why here?" he whispered. He returned to the main station and filed his report. It was short, precise. Subject: Junction 9 incident. Findings: non-destructive infiltration. Purpose: likely data gathering. Emotional biometric scans. Target: refugee children. Conclusion: not strategic. Psychological, possibly symbolic. Addendum: the mural drew attention. Recommend observation. The coalition's senior security officer flagged the report but delayed response pending further analysis. Meanwhile, the Zrathan delegation canceled all public appearances for the day. No explanation was offered. No apology issued. That evening, Elias made a single update in his notebook. A drawing of the mural, surrounded by small, faint question marks. At the center, he circled the vaguely human figure with exaggerated hair and wrote underneath, "They're not studying the war. They're studying who we protect." And for the first time, Elias Wren looked genuinely uneasy. The room was quieter than usual when Elias Wren requested the floor. It wasn't common for an observer to speak, especially not in the middle of a formal session, but he didn't raise his voice. He simply stood, one hand resting lightly on his notebook, and looked toward General Skorak. The Zrathan gave a faint nod. It was permission or maybe curiosity. Either way, no one stopped him. "I'd like to share something," Elias began. Not a rebuttal, just a story. The diplomats exchanged uncertain glances, but they said nothing. Skorak leaned back in his seat, arms folded, unblinking. Elias didn't look at his notes. He didn't pace. He simply spoke. "Thousands of years ago, back on Earth, our ancestors burned half their world trying to dominate each other. We clawed through wars over dirt, over faith, over pride. We fought until oceans boiled and skies turned gray. And when there was almost nothing left, something strange happened." He paused. "We changed." Some of the delegates leaned forward. The coalition lead, Ambassador Urine, said nothing but kept her eyes fixed on him. Skorak did not move. "We didn't change because someone forced us. No stronger empire came to teach us better ways. We changed because we saw what we were doing to our own children. We saw their lungs fill with ash. We watched them grow up afraid. And when we saw them stop laughing, we broke." He smiled, not out of amusement, but reflection. And in that breaking, we rebuilt. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but differently. We built shelters before weapons. We listened more. We mourned our mistakes and passed them down, not as glory, but as warnings. That's why I'm here. Not to threaten, not to interfere, but to remind you what happens when a species remembers what it almost lost. Skorak's expression hadn't changed, but the room felt colder. He didn't interrupt. He didn't smirk. He simply listened. Elias closed his notebook. "I'm just an observer. I was told not to speak unless necessary. I suppose I decided this was necessary." He stepped back, sat down, and folded his hands. No applause, no immediate reaction. But something fundamental had shifted. Skorak stood before anyone else. "This session is concluded," he said. No one dared to challenge the tone. As the room cleared, Urien whispered to her aide, "That wasn't a story. That was a reckoning." And on a hidden deck far above, a Zrathanave sent a quiet message home. The human does not bluff, he believes. The message came without ceremony. A simple, sealed transmission from the Zrathan delegation. General Skorak requests a private audience with observer Elias Wren. No security, no recorders. The coalition was divided. Some called it a trap. Others argued it was a breakthrough. Elias said nothing. He accepted. The meeting was held in a decommissioned observatory wing, unused since the station's star mapping systems were relocated. No lights, just the glow of distant stars bleeding through the thick panoramic glass. Skorak was already there, standing alone. Elias entered quietly. He didn't speak. He waited. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the general turned. "When I first learned of your species," Skorak said, "I laughed. A world of mammals who think with emotion, who fight with desperation, who breed chaos wherever they go." He took a step forward. "But I stopped laughing when we studied your endurance wars, your plague eras, your deep collapse recoveries. We've seen species die from a single failed harvest. You survived 4 apocalypses and kept walking." Elias said nothing. "You shouldn't be here," Skorak continued, voice lower. "This station, these talks, they are for those who understand the lines between peace and annihilation. Your kind erases those lines. You turn war into survival contests. You turn enemies into students. No doctrine accounts for that." The Zrathan's hands were clenched, not in rage, but in tension. "Strain. Our models predicted your influence would destabilize morale within 5 cycles. That exposure to human presence in a neutral setting would erode Zrathan's superiority doctrine." Skorak turned back toward the stars. "And now, we are afraid." Elias finally spoke, his voice even. "You fear us because you think we're unpredictable." "No," Skorak said sharply. "We fear you because you are inevitable." There it was, the truth behind the eyes. Not hatred, not fury, but the cold realization of inevitability. The Zrathans were warriors bred for conquest, but they'd encountered something they could not absorb, crush, or ignore. A species that didn't dominate through force, but through presence. "I was told you came as an observer," Skorak said. "But I see now, you are the test." And we failed. Elias stepped forward, slowly. "No," he said, "you're still deciding." Skorak looked at him one last time. Then he turned and walked away, his shoulders heavy with something far greater than defeat. Later that night, Elias wrote just one sentence in his notebook. "The general has seen the shape of the future, and it has a human face." At 400 station time, every alarm aboard Argento Prime activated at once. Emergency lockdown. Unidentified warships inbound. Coalition defense systems scrambled to respond, but their protocols stalled because the ships weren't attacking. They weren't broadcasting warnings, threats, or ultimatums. They were transmitting surrender codes. Zrathan codes. Dozens of them. The first message was short. "We no longer fight a war we cannot win." The second was stranger. "Human observer sighted. Doctrine invalidated." The coalition's command center erupted into chaos. Military leaders demanded confirmation. Analysts searched for tricks, traps, hidden fleets. Nothing came. Just the slow arrival of Zrathan cruisers, deactivating weapons, shutting down engines, and floating quietly into neutral space like great beasts offering their own extinction. Ambassador Urien called for an emergency assembly. Elias arrived late. He walked in with quiet steps and sat in the same chair, far from the center, his notebook under one arm. The chamber had transformed from a war room to something more surreal, a courtroom without a trial, a celebration without music. Skorak was already there. He stood alone in the center, unarmed, unguarded, a symbol stripped of armor. His voice was calm when he spoke. "I am not here to negotiate. I am here to release my species from a cycle we no longer understand." No one interrupted. No one dared. "We believed in strength as identity, in victory as right, but now we have met a species who fights without hate, who resists without malice, and who stands not for conquest, but for meaning." He looked directly at Elias. "Your kind should not be feared. You should be followed." The words hit like thunder. Some delegates gaped. Others whispered, stunned. A few openly wept. Generations of bloodshed and dogma, appended by the quiet resolve of a species still learning how vast the stars truly were. After a long pause, Ilias stood. He didn't speak to Skorek. He spoke to everyone. This isn't a victory. It's a choice. He looked around the chamber slowly. You can end your war now, not because you were forced, but because you saw something worth becoming. No one replied, but the silence was no longer empty. It was full, dense with understanding. 3 hours later, the coalition formally suspended all military operations. 8 hours after that, the Zrathan fleet decommissioned its forward command nodes. And for the first time in 82 cycles, no shots were fired across the border. Elias returned to his quarters and wrote, "The war didn't end with a weapon. It ended with a mirror. Years passed. Borders dissolved. Trade routes flourished. The Zrathan Dominion became the Zrathan Accord, joining the coalition not as former enemies, but as equals seeking something beyond survival, something closer to purpose." And through it all, the story of the human observer never faded. They told it in different ways. On distant outposts, children played games where one pretended to be Elias Wren, the quiet human who defeated an empire without lifting a weapon. On Zrathan memorial stones, his name was carved in their native script, not as a conqueror, but as a quiet fire, a force not of destruction, but of change. Academies studied his transcripts. Political schools debated his methods. Was it psychological warfare, strategic empathy, a long con manipulation, or was it something simpler, a mirror held up just long enough to make giants see their own reflections? No one ever agreed. Elias Wren never returned to the negotiating table. He declined honors, titles, even offers to lead interspecies councils. When asked why, his only response was, "I was just there to watch." But his legend grew anyway. On the 10th anniversary of the armistice, a monument was raised in Junction 9, the place where the war almost reignited. It wasn't a statue of Elias. He had forbidden likenesses. Instead, they recreated the mural drawn by the refugee children. Planets with smiling faces, a sun in sunglasses, and in the middle, the exaggerated human figure, hair wild, arms open. At the bottom was a plaque, "To the one who reminded us who we could be." Older Zrathan veterans visited the mural and stood silently. Some brought their children. Some bowed their heads. Some just stared. In the coalition archives, his final entry was preserved. Peace is not the absence of war. It is the presence of those willing to choose something better again and again, even when they are afraid. Rumors persisted, of course, that Elias Wren wasn't a normal human, that he had been trained in secret, that Earth sent him knowing what his presence would do. But the truth, for those who had met him, was far simpler. He was a man who listened, a man who observed, and when the moment came, he reminded the galaxy of what humanity had learned the hard way. That empathy, when wielded with clarity, could be stronger than fear. And that the most dangerous human in the room was never the one carrying a weapon. It was the one who didn't need one.